All right, it's 1:02, and we have a lot to go over. So let's just jump right in. Um, Welcome to the REV UP Massachusetts 2024 webinar. It's a big election year, so we're so happy to be able to have this webinar at such a uh, timely on such a timely week. Still have some time to register to vote and to vote. So on your screen, there is a Rev Up Massachusetts logo and a Disability Law Center logo. And now I'll just go over some housekeeping. So ASL interpreters and CART are available. ASL interpreters are spotlighted. This webinar is being recorded and slides will be distributed afterwards, as well as you will have access to the recordings. To turn on captions, you'll press the Show Captions or CC icon. We will be holding questions until the end of the presentation, so please take note of your questions or type them in the Q&A box as we're presenting so that we can share them later on, answer them later on. You can also use the raise hand function and turn your video on when you're speaking if possible. When we ask you to ask your question, we'll give you permission to unmute. But like I said, we will save that to the end of the presentation. During the question and answer portion, we will also be reviewing some of the questions that were left in the chat or Q&A boxes. Just be sure that you're keeping chat to a minimum so that it's not distracting to other viewers. So our agenda today, we already got through housekeeping very quickly. We will be introducing the panelists for today and Disability Law Center and Rev Up. We'll also go over some important dates and voter registration information. We'll talk about the legal rights of Massachusetts voters, accessible electronic vote by mail, tips for accessibility surveys and how to follow up with advocacy, an overview of polling place accessibility, and then we will, as promised, leave some time for questions and answers at the end. So now I'll have the panelists turn their cameras on and introduce themselves. First, I'll start with Tom Murphy, supervising attorney.
Good afternoon. It's telling me that I can't start my video, unfortunately, but I'll just quickly introduce myself. My name is Tom Murphy. I'm a supervising attorney here at DLC. And if my video worked, I would describe myself as well. I'm a middle-aged white male with a beard and a shaved head.
Yeah, I'm not sure there's a way to allow folks to turn on their cameras. For now, I'll just move on to Tatum.
Hi, everyone. It seems to be within the host's control, the video. So my name is Tatum Pritchard. I'm the Director of Litigation at the Disability Law Center. I use she, her pronouns. And when you see me in a little while, you will see a middle-aged woman with light brown hair, and I am wearing glasses today.
Let's see. Linda has a hand raised. Oh.
Sorry, I added Tom and Tatum to co-host, and now they can be on camera when they're on video.
Great. And see, I don't know how to, sorry. Who is the person that has their hand raised?
Linda L.
Yes, Linda.
Never mind.
Oh, okay. Sorry about that, everyone. Still new to webinars. So hi, everyone. I'm Brianna Zimmerman. I'm the voting rights advocate at Disability Law Center. I just started in September, and I'm a white woman with long blonde hair. I have glasses that are round, and I'm wearing a black, white, and blue floral dress. And I have a blurred gray background. So I'll introduce a little bit about Disability Law Center and what we do. On your screen, you'll see the DLC logo with the scales of justice, and it says the Protection and Advocacy Agency for People with Disabilities. So DLC is the Protection and Advocacy Agency for the state of Massachusetts. Sometimes we use the term P&A, and that means protection and advocacy. There are P&A or protection and advocacy systems throughout the US states and territories. The P&A system is a national network of disability rights agencies, and we investigate abuse, neglect, we provide legal representation, and also advocacy services to people with disabilities. And we are a nonprofit legal services organization. So while we do receive state, federal, and some private funding, we're not a part of the federal government or the state government. We just receive funding from those sources. Disability Law Center does lots of different work. We collaborate and advocate with other agencies, some of whom are on this call today, including, independent living centers is one example of other agencies that we might collaborate with, monitor and investigate abuse and neglect of people with disabilities. We monitor polling places for accessibility, which you'll learn a lot more about later. We provide representation in civil legal issues related to one's disability. We provide information and referral. And we conduct trainings, such as this one, about legal rights of people with disabilities. And that includes, of course, voting rights. So we do lots of different things, and you can always visit our website, dlc-ma.org. So what is REV UP? REV UP stands for Register, Educate, Vote, Use Your Power. So REV UP is a national movement that was organized by AAPD, which stands for the American Association of People with Disabilities. And AAPD basically built the REV UP movement to increase civic engagement, increase the accessibility of voting procedures. We are the state branch of REV UP. So REV UP Massachusetts is a statewide coalition of different organizations throughout the state. We sponsor the REV UP project on the state level, and Metro West Center for Independent Living provides lots of technical support and manages our website. We have lots of different members of REV UP, and you can always visit REV UP's website at revupma.org. And please sign up for email updates. Information about future trainings and webinars like this one will always be sent out to anyone on the email list. All right, so we have a big election coming up, some of you might know about. And so there's a lot of different important dates to know about. I get a lot of questions like, do I have time still to register, to update my registration? Is there still time to apply to vote by mail? So yes, and so I'll go over those specific dates. So Saturday, October 26th is the voter registration deadline. So that's this Saturday. It's coming up quick. And you can register by mail. Just note that your registration has to be postmarked by October 26th. That means that like it needs to be in the mail by October 26th, ideally earlier. If you're registering in person, you have to register by 5 p.m. on Saturday. Most like town clerks or city clerks, local election offices will be holding voter registration drives on Saturday. So that's also an opportunity for you to register. You can also register or update your registration information online. That can be done by 11:59 p.m. on October 26th. So you have a little bit more time if you're registering online. Early voting has already started to take place across Massachusetts. It started on October 19th, and the last day for early voting is November 1st. And you can find your community's early voting schedule by visiting the Secretary of State's website, which I've linked, or simply, contacting your local election office. Tuesday, October 29th. So that's a week from today is the deadline to apply to vote by mail or by accessible electronic vote by mail. And you'll hear more about accessible vote by mail a little bit later. But the deadline to apply for either a vote by mail or accessible ballot is that Tuesday, October 29th. And your application has to actually get to your local election office by 5 o'clock that day. So be sure that you're giving a few days to send that out and for it to be delivered. Ideally, you want to register as soon or apply to vote by mail as soon as possible. You can also, of course, do that in person or online, which is a little bit quicker. And then Tuesday, November 5th is election day. So on election day, polling locations across the state are going to be open 7 a.m. to 8 p.m. And if you're voting by mail, your ballot has to be postmarked by Tuesday, November 5th. So it has to be sent out by Tuesday, November 5th to be counted. And if you're returning your ballot in person or electronically through accessible vote by mail, you have to have your ballot in by the close of the polls at 8 p.m. So there's a few ways to register and update your voter registration. You should do this, every time that you move, your name changes. Yeah, those are pretty much the two circumstances in which, you would really want to update your voter registration form. You can always check your voter registration information, make sure that it's up to date, that your address and name are all correct by visiting the Secretary of State's website, which I've linked to this slide. Anyone can check their voter registration that way. You can also register online, like for the first time, but you have to have a state ID or driver's license, or learner's permits can also work to register online. If you don't have an ID and you're registering for the first time, then you'll have to do it either by mail or in person. And to do that, you can download a form and print it in a variety of languages, or you can go to your local election office, whatever is easier for you. So I think this is a repetitive slide, but again, it's really important to register. as soon as possible and to check that registration information to make sure it's all up to date. So I've linked the website where you can check that information again. And note that you can also pre-register to vote if you're 16 or 17. And that way you'll be all ready to vote once you turn 18. So I've just provided a screenshot of what it will look like when you are registering to vote, updating your address, updating your name, updating your political party. So this screenshot shows the online voter registration system. You can access it in a variety of languages. And like I said, this is sort of a one-stop location for you to check all of your registration information or register online if you have one of those state issued IDs. This is another screenshot of sort of the next step of registering to vote online. You'll need to basically fill out all of the required fields, which will have a little asterisk. And basically you'll want to fill out your name, your date of birth, and then your 9-character ID number. So that'll just be the number that's on your state ID, license, learner's permit. You can also update your voter registration or register to vote by mail or in person. And I've attached a copy of what those voter registration forms look like. So this is the top and bottom halves of the voter registration forms. They'll, you'll have to confirm whether or not you're a citizen of the United States. Only citizens can vote. So if you're not a US citizen, you cannot vote. Your full name, your former name, if it's applicable, your address, where you live, and also where you receive your mail. So if those addresses are different, you'll want to indicate that. Your date of birth, a sort of ID number, such as Social Security, some contact information if you have it, and a political party if you'd like to enroll in one. And of course, you'll have to make sure that you're signing and dating your application. So if you're registering to vote for the first time, you might be asked for an ID. And it's recommended that if you are applying to vote for the first time, that you attach a copy of your ID to the application. So, if you're mailing it, you can print a copy of your ID and mail it in. Otherwise, if you don't do that, you might just be asked the first time that you go to vote for your ID. Some people don't have an ID, right? So when you go to vote for the first time, or when you're applying for the first time, you could just include your driver's license. Oh, sorry, a driver's license is a form of ID, but other sort of like forms of ID that we often don't think about as forms of ID are, utility bills, rent receipts, leases, a copy of a voter registration affidavit, which your local election office should help you with. Any sort of information that contains like your name and address can be used as a form of ID. And so I've attached copies of just like sample IDs. One is a Massachusetts driver's license with a photo of a man with brown hair. And another one is a Massachusetts ID card with a photo of a woman with blonde hair. And those are just two forms of ID. Like I said, there are some less traditional forms as well, like that are just as valid. So there's a number of legal rights that Massachusetts voters have. And so some of those have been established by like federal laws, and there's also some Massachusetts specific regulations. So the Help America Vote Act of 2002, also abbreviated as HAVA, requires jurisdictions to actually have at least one accessible voting machine that people with disabilities can use, at least in federal elections. However, Massachusetts actually requires those machines for all elections. So in Massachusetts, the accessible voting machines are called the automark. And we require that at least one automark is in every polling place. The accessible voting system has to give people the same opportunity for access and participation, and allow people to vote privately and independently. And we'll go through a little bit of what the automark does later on. The Americans with Disabilities Act, Title II, requires state and local governments to make sure that people with disabilities have full and equal opportunities to vote. So this actually, a lot of people don't realize that this applies to all parts of the voting process, not just actually going to vote, although of course that's an important part of it, but it also applies to when cities and towns are selecting polling places, they should be accessible. It also applies to voter registration processes that should be accessible to people with a variety of disabilities. Accessing information about voting should be accessible. For example, election websites should be accessible. Early voting, absentee voting, and vote by mail should be available. And there should be accessible options for voting. And also voting in person on election day should be made as accessible as possible. And up until, so every single part of the voting process should be accessible. That also includes actually casting your ballot. The Voting Rights Act of 1965 is another federal law, and that requires election officials to allow people who have disabilities to get assistance from a person of their choosing. The only exception is that it cannot be a person's employer or the voters' union or a representative of the voters' union. So that is in place because, you know, there's obviously a power dynamic between your employer and yourself, or between a union and yourself. And the other thing that the Voting Rights Act does is it doesn't allow the right to vote to be based on a citizen being able to read or write, you know, passing a literacy test or interpretation test or having a particular level of education. So that's also really important. And I've linked some more voting rights and federal laws in this slide as well. So who has the right to vote in Massachusetts? So basically you have the right to vote in Massachusetts if you're a citizen of the United States, you're 18 years old, and you're not currently incarcerated for a felony conviction, and your guardianship doesn't prohibit you from voting. So although you cannot vote before the age of 18, like I said, you can pre-register to vote, which is great because, you know, you can be all ready to vote before your 18th birthday. You can also vote in Massachusetts after you're released from prison, even if you're on parole or probation. You can also vote if you're incarcerated but you're not currently serving time for a felony that you've been convicted of. So if you're serving time, say, for a misdemeanor, or you haven't been convicted yet, you can still vote. You can also vote in Massachusetts under a guardianship, as long as that guardianship doesn't specifically say that you cannot register to vote or vote. And that's pretty rare that that would happen. So Massachusetts voters have the right to vote privately, independently, accessibly, such as with an auto mark machine. People with disabilities have the right to seek assistance from a person of their choice. That can include a poll worker, or it could include a friend or family member if that's who you're comfortable with. It cannot, of course, include an employer or agent of your union, as I said before. You can ask for reasonable accommodations from your local election office to help you with the voting process. And you can also ask your local election office to tell you about any sort of voting aids, assistance, or different ways to vote, such as voting by mail, an electronic accessible ballot, or absentee ballot procedures. So they should be able to help you with answering all of those questions. And if you prefer to vote in person, your polling place really should be accessible. And voting by mail or electronic voting is always your choice if you prefer to vote in person. Like I said, there should be, it should be accessible. So there's also, a population of people that are institutionalized. And institutions can include nursing homes, state institutions for people with different sorts of disabilities, like developmental or psychiatric disabilities, locked psych facilities, group homes, assisted living, veterans homes, jails, or prisons. So unless you are legally determined and eligible to vote, people in institutions have the same right to vote as everyone else. Like I said, you would want to make sure that you're not currently incarcerated for a felony conviction, or that your guardianship doesn't prevent you from voting. And eligible voters that live in institutions should also be able to get information about voting and elections. They should have different options for voting. This can include voting at a polling place unless you're prohibited to do so by the terms of your commitment, which can be the case a lot of times, especially in places like jails or prisons. But you should also have the opportunity to vote absentee or vote by mail, and also to get help with that process. And so I know Disability Law Center is actually, helping folks in different types of institutions register to vote and apply for a ballot. And a lot of people in institutions don't realize that they have the right to vote. So it's really important to know that as long as they're eligible, people who are institutionalized also have the right to vote. And I've linked a resource from the National Disability Rights Network about voting in institutions or facilities. But you can feel free to also reach out to me with any questions after this about specific situations. Okay, so now we'll get into some more accessible voting procedures. I'm really excited to hear more and talk more about accessible vote by mail, which a lot of folks don't know about. And I think I'm going to hand it over to Tatum.
Thank you. So accessible electronic vote by mail, like vote by mail, is a more recent option in Massachusetts. During the COVID-19 pandemic, as many recall, people with, well, every voter wanted to be able to vote from home. And in Massachusetts, the absentee voting process was not available to everyone because we had what's called an excuse-based or a reason-based absentee voting program. We did not have a no excuse absentee voting program like other states have had. So vote by mail was an invention to create a no excuse remote voting option for everyone during the pandemic. Obviously, people from all parts of the country and all parts of Massachusetts were looking to avoid going out to many places in public, including to their polling sites. People with disabilities were no different, of course, and they too had the right to be able to vote safely, accessibly, and independently from the safety of their home. At the time that vote by mail was enacted in 2020 as part of a temporary Massachusetts law, it only required that the Secretary of the Commonwealth, because of advocacy of REV UP and DLC's executive director at the time, it required that there was an accessible way of marking the ballot. That then required the person to print out the marked ballot and then manage to sign the line on the envelope to certify the accuracy and validity of the ballot, put it into another envelope, and send that through the mail. So the first barrier that we had when vote by mail was enacted and this first version of the accessible procedures were put in place was that the Secretary of the Commonwealth didn't believe that the law required the Commonwealth to make accessible marked ballots available during the 2020 primary. As a result, while hundreds of thousands or more of vote by mail applications were going out throughout the Commonwealth, they were not taking any steps to implement the accessible ballot marking procedures that the law incorporated. So DLC, representing a number of individual voters, the Bay State Council of the Blind, and the Boston Center for Independent Living brought the first case to the Supreme Judicial Court to require the Secretary of the Commonwealth to implement that first part of the process. And we successfully got an order that allowed for our clients and our client community who knew of the option to mark their ballots in an online platform, print them out and certify them by hand and mail them in. The problem with this process was, of course, that it's not fully accessible, and it required people who could not access a standard print ballot due to their disability, whether that be because they are blind, have low vision, or have a mobility or dexterity disability that makes it difficult for them to mark a ballot or otherwise handle a ballot that's in standard print paper format. It made them have a printer, unlike every other voter who could vote from home. And it also required, for the vast majority of people, them to still get assistance. After marking their ballot, they would have to print it out. They would most likely need assistance in determining whether, if they had a vision disability, determining whether the printed ballot was accurate and complete. Then they would need assistance with signing in the appropriate spot on the envelope. and managing all of the envelopes. The same goes for people who are not able to include a hand-drawn signature for disability-related reasons. They were not able to certify their ballot with a handwritten signature as required by the existing law. So in any case, Disability Law Center, with our same team and a couple of different individual voters, went to the Federal District Court of Massachusetts with another case to ensure complete accessibility for the general election in 2020. So we were seeking not only an accessible way of marking the ballot electronically, but also electronic certification, the opportunity to certify a ballot with a typewritten signature if you couldn't write or insert a hand-drawn signature, and then electronic submission. So that case resolved rather quickly through an agreed upon judgment. The Federal District Court issued an order requiring all of those accommodations be put in place for the 2020 general election. And this was a huge victory for voters in Massachusetts, but also voters across the country who couldn't access a standard print ballot and who wanted to be able to submit ballots in a secure and electronic way without the assistance of other people. The problem was, and I know this is a lot of history, so I'll move it along. The problem was that vote by mail as a program expired after the 2020 general election, and our work was not done. Throughout 2021 and the first half of 2022, DLC and our partners continued advocating for permanent incorporation of accessible electronic remote voting programs into Massachusetts law. This included another case prepared against the city of Boston, which resolved by settlement agreement and required the city to have accessible electronic vote by mail and absentee voting processes and programs in place. Building from that, we worked with voters from other municipalities to get their cities and towns to also provide these accommodations, because the Secretary of the Commonwealth was not taking responsibility for providing them in local election years. We also continued to advocate with the state legislature and the Secretary of the Commonwealth's office to include this robust set of accommodations to ensure access. All of this came to a head in June of 2022 when the Votes Act passed with an amendment DLC pushed for to ensure that accessible electronic vote by mail accommodations were included in Massachusetts' permanent vote by mail program. Again, allowing voters with disabilities who cannot access a standard print ballot to mark, certify, and return their ballots electronically. This is currently done by a contract with Democracy Live. It's as I understand it from clients and members of our community, it is a pretty easy to use platform, and people have been really pleased with the independence and accessibility that it permits. You want to move on, Brianna?
Yeah. So thank you so much. And we also wanted to have a note about emergency absentee ballots, which you can apply for if you're hospitalized or admitted to some sort of healthcare facility within a week of the election. You have until 8 p.m. on election day to request an emergency absentee ballot. You'll fill out an application, and one option is to designate a person of your choice to deliver that application to your local election office, pick up a ballot, deliver it to you, you mark your ballot, and then they can return your ballot for you by the close of the polls on election day. However, I know Tatum, you might have something to add about voting
Sure.
accessibly.
So the Votes Act is simply discussing the accommodations for the vote by mail program. However, the Secretary of the Commonwealth has informed DLC, as we requested pretty strenuously, that those accommodations be made available to people who had planned to vote in person, for instance, using the automark, but found themselves hospitalized unexpectedly, and so wanted, and needed to be able to vote accessibly as part of the emergency absentee ballot program. This was approved, or the Secretary of the Commonwealth has told us that if such a situation arose, that the same accommodations for vote by mail, allowing for electronic marking, certification, and return, would be permitted for someone who needed to vote via emergency absentee ballot. I have not yet heard of anyone attempting this, but we wanted to make sure it was included in this training so that people know that it's available, and know that if you're running into any barriers, that you should please let the law center know.
Thank you so much. So I think Tatum already went through so much of what accessible vote by mail is, but I'll just repeat. People with disabilities can apply for the accessible vote by mail ballot if you have a disability that makes it difficult to mark a ballot independently. And when you apply, you can also, like Tatum had said, typewrite your signature if you can't independently sign it with a pen and paper. And so there's a variety of ways to apply for a vote by mail or accessible vote by mail ballot. And so for an accessible vote by mail ballot, you would be able to mark it electronically on your phone, tablet, or computer. And you can either print it after marking it, or you can just submit it electronically. So you can apply for these ballots online. Just make sure that you check the box if you do need an accessible electronic ballot. Make sure you check that box that says that's what you need. If you're applying by mail, there are two different forms. There's an accessible vote by mail ballot, and then there's the standard vote by mail application. And so make sure that you download the accessible vote by mail if you need that accessible electronic ballot. Otherwise, you'll use a standard vote by mail application. Your local election office should also be able to help you apply in person. And you can find their info at the Secretary of State's website, which I've linked. And you can also apply by email or fax. So that's kind of nice to not have to print something. And you can find your local election office's email and fax information also on the Secretary of State's website. And on this slide, there's a white vote by mail Massachusetts application. It has the Massachusetts state seal, and it looks like a white postcard. Every registered voter should receive this to the address that you're registered at. If you didn't receive it, you can always call your local election office and ask them for another copy, or you could simply, like I said, apply online, print out an application, or email or fax an application. I won't go through all of this, but on the screen, you'll just see screenshots of the Massachusetts vote by mail application, and I describe what they ask for. So voter information, which ballots you need a vote by mail ballot for, sorry, which elections you need a vote by mail ballot for. There's only one election left this year, so you could just check all elections this year if you were using this application. Again, just another screenshot of the bottom half of the application. And if you require assistance with this application, it's important to note that you can get that assistance. You can just have the person fill out their name and their address. And this could be anyone that you choose. Like we said, all steps of the voting process, including applying to vote by mail, should be accessible. So if you'd like someone to assist you, just make sure that you check that box. And then also, if your application is being made by a family member, say, your mom is doing it for you, with your consent, of course, and you're away at college or in the hospital, they could also mark that box. And then this is the accessible vote by mail application. It looks very similar to the standard vote by mail application, which is what we want. And you'll be required, the difference is you'll be required to put your email address. So you should have an email address if you want to use the accessible ballot. And then again, you would mark which elections you want an accessible ballot for. And if you want to return your ballot by mail instead of electronically online, you would just put your mailing address on the line that says mailing address. That will make sure that you have those proper envelopes to secure your ballot. So that's only if you want to print out your ballot and mail it or deliver it in person. Again, you can check if you need an accommodation. So if you want to use the accessible vote by mail system because you're not independently able to mark a paper ballot, you would mark that box. And then if you are signing with a typewritten name, you would also check that box because, and you could check one or the other box, like if you don't necessarily need an accessible vote by mail ballot, you don't want to use that electronic system, but you just want to typewrite your signature, that's totally fine. You can just mark the second box saying that you are using a typewritten name. And again, same thing as before, you'll mark whether or not you received assistance and sign your name. The difference is that you can typewrite your name for this application. You'll receive instructions on how to return your vote by mail and accessible vote by mail ballot. Like I said, you can do that electronically, in person, or by mail. If you're returning it in person, just make sure that you're doing it either during early voting hours at an early voting location. You can deliver it directly to like your town clerk or city clerk, any of your local election office by 8 p.m. on election day, or at your local drop box by 8 p.m. And you can find your local drop box again on the Secretary of State's website. Some cities have various locations. Some smaller towns only have one. And there's some really helpful videos about how to use the accessible vote by mail system on the Democracy Live website, which is the system that Tatum had mentioned Massachusetts uses for accessible vote by mail. All right, so we'll switch gears a little bit. We have lots to cover, but really important that we discuss polling place accessibility surveys and requirements for polling places. So if you're going to vote in person, as I mentioned, your polling place should be accessible, and that includes for early voting as well. Um, so we definitely need volunteers. I know that some of you on the call have already volunteered, so thank you to people who have already volunteered to do polling place accessibility surveys. You can sign up to volunteer on our website, and I've linked that. You can fill out a long survey, which is very helpful. I know it says long survey, and when you look at it, it can be a little bit intimidating at first, but really it's very easy. The long survey walks you through every step of ensuring that your polling place is accessible. And we'll go over some of the questions that we ask and sort of simplify the process for you. Really, the tool makes it very easy, and you don't need to be an expert on ADA or Massachusetts Code of Regulations in order to fill these out. I usually don't know all the answers to every single question either. So DLC is always here to help and work on the advocacy piece as well if there are some accessibility barriers that you see. You can also fill out a short form to report some barriers that you experienced while voting. So if you're a voter and you go to your polling place, and you're not necessarily doing a long survey, but you find that the auto mark machine doesn't work, or that the entrance isn't accessible and it was really hard for you to get in the door, please do report that using the short survey. We really want to hear about your experiences voting in this election. And as you're doing polling place accessibility surveys and learning about them, just sort of imagine the process that you go through when you vote. So you arrive, you park, you are walking inside or walking from the parking lot inside to the polling place. Is that accessible? Would it be easy for someone to trip over broken pavement or to get their casters stuck in pavement? Those are the sorts of things you'll want to think about. Is the entrance accessible? Is there a big lip going into the doorway? Is the actual inside of the polling place accessible? So is there enough room for someone using a mobility device to move around freely and to vote accessibly and privately? And so we'll go through the specifics of those considerations and requirements. And for that, I will hand it over to Tom in just a moment, actually, because I'm realizing I just had a quick, I had screenshotted the short form survey, which just asks about, where your polling place was, what types of problems you had at your polling place. And you can upload pictures. You can indicate whether or not polling place staff were able to help you. And also your name and contact info so that we can get in touch with you afterwards and we can help advocate with you if you did encounter accessibility barriers. And I'll hand it over to Tom.
Thanks, Brianna. And again, thank you all for being here. And if you are planning to do a polling place survey, accessibility survey for us, thank you so much, because obviously there are hundreds and hundreds of polling places in the Commonwealth. We can't possibly get to them all. We've been to a lot, but there are many that we have not been to. And the more that folks can give us input on, the better it will be. And that will really help us in our advocacy to make sure that every polling place in Massachusetts is accessible. So if you are going to be checking out either, hopefully at least your polling place where you vote, but also others as well if you choose to take that on. We would recommend that you always bring something with you to take notes, even on your phone, but pen and paper. So, you can always, Brianna, we had the links on the prior slide to surveys that we use. Don't feel that that you need to, have those open and available to you while you're doing the survey. Might be a good idea to take a look at those in advance, so that you have in your mind the sorts of things that you should be looking for, and then you could always take notes, take pictures, and then go back when you get home and transfer that information to our forms and send those to us. It's a good idea to have a tape measure with you, so that you can measure spaces like the width of doorways, ramps, things like that. If you have a smart level, that really is ideal, but certainly not something that would be mandatory. Any basic type of tape measure will really be helpful for you. You do want to bring your phone or a camera, have a way to record information by taking pictures. It is really important, though, that you don't take pictures of people who are at the polls, whether they be people who are voting or poll workers. So make sure that, if you are taking pictures, that you're just taking a picture of the information that you're trying to convey, and that there are no people captured as well. And make sure that they're clear. So you may want to just take a couple just to be sure. And as I measured, things like a digital smart level or pressure gauge to measure door weight are really ideal to have when performing accessibility surveys, but we understand that most people are not going to have those. So don't think that that's something that's mandatory. I always think, and we strongly encourage, if you're doing an accessibility survey, that it's best practice to check in immediately with the person who's in charge at the polling place. If you're not sure who that is, just ask somebody who's obviously a poll worker. They'll point them out. They're generally very friendly. They're generally happy to see us and to know that that we're doing our part to make sure that their polling place is accessible, because it is important to them as well. So just a friendly hello, and an explanation that you're going to be spending some time looking around and maybe taking some measurements, maybe taking some pictures. Let them know that you'll make sure not to capture any people in the pictures that you take. Next slide, please. So we're gonna we don't want to overwhelm you with information. So I want to just give you some basic tips to think about some of the major issues that you may encounter in terms of accessibility when you're doing a survey. And again, please, on your own after this webinar, take some time to review the long survey. That goes into a lot more detail than I'm going to go into right now about the types of issues, the types of measurements that we would be looking for, or even just, it will give you a sense of, hey, what should I be thinking about when I'm at a polling place. We also have a link here to a YouTube video, which gives a more detailed overview of accessibility surveys at polling places. And again, I would strongly encourage you to take a look at that on your own. Next. So this is a screenshot of a screen on our accessibility survey. It gives you the information that you're looking for, and then it gives you bubbles to fill in either yes, no, or other in terms of what the answer to the question is. So, for example, when you first arrive at a polling place, you will be either outside or in a parking lot. So we would ask, are the paths of travel to the polling place from the parking lot or from the street clear, reasonably lit, and unobstructed? All right, so that can be either yes, no, or other. And you can upload pictures as well to give a little bit more context to your answer. We would be looking for things like the path of travel, having a continuous common surface that's not interrupted by any change in level that's greater than 1/2 inch. An important consideration is if the accessible entrance to a polling place is not the entrance that others use, is the path of travel to the accessible entrance about the same? Are there curb cuts that have been provided from the parking lot to the sidewalk or to the entry area? So again, these are just sort of examples of the kinds of issues that we're going to ask you to look for. And this screenshot gives you an idea of what the survey form looks like. And you can, again, please take a look at that before you do a survey. Next. As Brianna said earlier, I think the best way to approach a polling place accessibility survey is to think about the process that you use when you go to vote. You will arrive at the polling place. You will be in a parking lot. So is there accessible parking? You will then go from the parking lot through a path of travel to the entrance to the polling place. So is there an accessible entrance? Does that entrance have door hardware that is accessible? Are there changes in level? Are the doorways at least 32 inches clear with a threshold that does not exceed 1/2 inch? If there is an accessible entrance that is not the main entrance to the polling place, is there adequate signage to make it clear where a person who needs to use the accessible entrance should go? Next slide, please. The survey form also talks about the process of voting. As Brianna mentioned earlier, every polling place in Massachusetts is required to have an automark machine so that people with disabilities who cannot mark their ballot in the standard way can vote accessibly and independently. So we would ask you to look for the automark machine. Make sure that it's working. You can always ask a poll worker, hey, have you tested the automark machine? Are you sure that it's working? If you're doing a survey in the polling place where you'll be voting, I would encourage you to use the automark machine. I generally do when I vote. And it's a good way to familiarize yourself with it, but also importantly to make sure that it's working appropriately. So again, going through the form, these are some additional pieces of information that we would ask you for. Next slide, please. So now, just to get into a little bit more detail, as I said earlier, the first sort of element that you will encounter when you go to vote is the parking lot. We would want to make sure that there is accessible parking for people with disabilities. So that would mean at least one accessible space for every 25 parking spaces in the lot. On this slide, we have a black and white photo of 2 accessible parking spaces with an access aisle in between. That both accessible spaces are clearly marked with the universal symbol of disability to indicate that those spaces are meant set aside for people with disabilities. And also in this diagram, there is clearly a curb ramp from the access ramp up onto the sidewalk. Next slide, please. You can go to the next slide. Thanks, Brianna. No, I'm sorry. I got ahead of you. So This chart just shows the number of required accessible spaces. As I said earlier, there should be at least one for every 25 spaces in the parking lot. We don't necessarily expect you to count every space in the parking lot, but we would at least expect that there be accessible parking available. If you are at a polling place and there is parking that is provided for voters, and you notice that there are no designated, clearly marked accessible spaces, that would certainly be an issue that we would want you to flag. And there are some issues like that can be dealt with on the spot. So you could always get in touch with us on election day and let us know. That is an issue that we could potentially bring to the Secretary of State's office. They could send somebody out there and temporarily mark a spot to make sure that there is a designated accessible parking space. There should always be at least one. And there may be times when just as a fix for election day, we need to mark that space at least temporarily. And it's something that we can always circle back with afterwards if we need to. Okay, now we can go to the next slide, Brianna. Thanks. So the next element would be the path of travel and the entrance to the parking place. The path from the parking lot to the entrance should be clear. It should be reasonably well lit, should be unobstructed, uninterrupted by abrupt changes in level. Again, if there is an alternate accessible entrance, it should be reasonably similar distance to the main entrance to the polling place. There definitely needs to be at least one entrance that is accessible. And again, there should be adequate signage to an accessible entrance if the main entrance is not. Ramps should always be provided if there are any steps or large changes in level. Ramps that have non-slip walkways and handrails, and the doors should be able to be operated independently with a closed fist. Doorway width should be at least 32 inches, and again, there should not be a threshold of more than a half an inch. Next slide, please. So we have a couple of photographs actually from a polling place that Brianna was at fairly recently, to give you an idea of some of the issues that you may encounter and things that we would certainly want to know about, because there are some clear red flags here in terms of accessibility. This polling place happened to have a main entrance which was not accessible. There were multiple steps. And so there was an alternate accessible entrance that was designated to get into this particular building. There's a picture on this slide of that entrance, and I think some of the issues here are fairly obvious. This path of travel clearly is not a smooth, uninterrupted surface. There are cracks in the pavement. There's grass growing out of some of the cracks. In terms of the width of the path of travel, it's fine, but the path of travel itself clearly would pose dangerous barriers to a person with a disability. Another issue that stands out to me in this photograph, and this would require a little bit more work on your part, perhaps, but that door to me seems to be one that is quite heavy. Now, on this particular day, I think this was a nice day over the summer when Brianna was lucky enough to do this survey. The door was propped open, and that's okay. You may encounter that, but on November 5th, we may not have the type of day where they're going to want to prop open a door. So this particular door looks like it's made of metal, looks like it's quite heavy. If this door is closed on election day, it would most likely create an accessibility barrier. to a person with a disability. So, so that would be another issue that we would certainly want to have brought to our attention. Next slide, please. Here's another example of something that we unfortunately encounter quite often, which is that we have an accessible entrance, but and this is actually a photograph that's taken from a wider angle. So not only is the path of travel here a problem, as talked about in the previous slide, but it's also blocked. They have this nice sign that tells folks where they need to go, but they put the sign right in the middle of the path, which clearly means that a person who's using a wheelchair, in order to get around that sign, would need to leave the path of travel. And as you can see on the right there, there's some grass, and that would certainly pose a barrier. There are also what appear to be milk crates that are stacked against the wall. This is something, again, that we see fairly often with accessible entrances that may not get used very often, even ramps, that they get used as sort of secondary storage areas. And that clearly will create a path of travel issue. And again, these are fairly easy fixes, things that can be brought immediately to the attention of the person in charge, and if not, immediately to our attention, and that can be dealt with and rectified fairly quickly. Next slide, please. This next photograph shows a path of travel, which it's a little hard to tell, but this was actually the path of travel from the front of the building to the accessible entrance, and it's a rather long distance to travel, and it's hard to tell from this photo, but there was actually a fairly steep hill here. So this would definitely pose difficulties for a wheelchair user, for instance, both going up and then also coming down that hill, because there are no level landing areas. So for this particular polling place, the quote unquote accessible entrance really did pose a lot of barriers, and there are many issues that we have followed up on. So again, giving you some ideas of the things that we would want you to look for. Once you're inside the polling place, again, the voting area does need to be fully accessible with unobstructed paths of travel. Certainly you want to look out for protruding objects, especially if your polling place is in a school. Oftentimes there are display cases or stairways that could pose a barrier to a person with a vision impairment. Any protruding objects should have barriers set up around them. There should be at least one accessible voting booth. Again, the auto mark machine should be functioning, and it should allow for independent and private voting. And you can even you can ask. It's a good idea sometimes when you check in and meet the poll workers, to ask them, do you provide accommodations for people if they ask for them? What is your procedure? How would somebody communicate with you that perhaps they need, if there's a long line, they need to sit, and what would you do in order to address that? It's good to kind of flesh out that information a little bit, just to make sure that their training has included these types of issues. And we have a link here to a good guidance on on some of these issues as well. So we can go to the next slide. And here we have, just to kind of flesh that out a little bit more, a photograph of a ballot marking box. And on the left, we have the standard box, and on the right is one that is accessible to a person who uses a wheelchair. It's a little bit lower with adequate space underneath. and the person is able to independently access this this ballot marking box. We also have a service animal in this photograph to just sort of make it clear that that's another type of accommodation that can be provided for people as they vote. Under the ADA, service animals obviously are welcome in all places of public accommodation and in government places that are that are government run. Sorry, I just sort of blanked there for a second. We go to the next slide, please. Here we have a photograph of the AutoMark machine, and again, this does need to be placed in an area which allows for independent and accessible and private voting. If you notice that the AutoMark machine is set up in an area which would allow for someone else to see a person marking their ballot, that would be an issue that you would want to bring to the attention of the poll workers. There should be at least one AutoMark machine in each polling place. I think on the next slide we have a link to a video which we're not going to show now in the interest of time, but we would encourage you to watch this on your own. This video goes into greater detail about the AutoMark machine and its uses, and will give you a good sense of what you should be looking for. And again, I would encourage you, if you're voting and doing a survey of your polling place, to use the AutoMark machine if you can. Next slide.
All right, thank you so much, Tom. And I can take over the last couple slides. I want to make sure that we leave plenty, at least a little bit of time for answering some questions. So again, you can volunteer to conduct a polling place accessibility survey using a long form, or you can fill out a short survey to just describe your experiences with voting. If you encounter any accessibility barriers, especially, we'll want to know about that and where you encountered those barriers. You can always reach out to myself in the Disability Law Center if you have any questions or experience any barriers when voting, or if you have any other questions about polling place accessibility surveys. I'm Brianna Zimmerman, the voting rights advocate at Disability Law Center. My contact information is on the slide, but it is bzimmerman@dlc-ma.org. And my phone number is 617-315-4593. You can also always call our intake line if you encounter issues voting, or if you have voting questions. You can call 617-723-8455. There's also an 800 number on the slide and on our website. And you can also fill out an intake form online. And I've linked that form on this slide. You could also contact your local election office or ADA coordinator. That would especially be helpful if you, as a voter, encounter a barrier when voting. You want to make sure that your local election office and possibly, ADA coordinator, or maybe your Commission on Disability too might be helpful. You'll want to make sure that you let them know about that as well. We can always assist with advocacy as well. I know not everyone is comfortable taking that on themselves, but it is your right to make sure that your local election office is aware of those issues. And you can also contact the Secretary of State to make sure that they know about the accessibility issues that you experienced. So I've put the Secretary of State's election division contact information. You can call 800-462-VOTE or 8683. Or you can email elections@sec.ma.us. So you can always as well advocate and just let the Secretary of State know about any experiences or barriers that you encounter. And I just want to leave a few minutes for questions and answers. I know we already have a bunch of questions in the Q&A box, and so I'll stop sharing now. Great. So we have one question in the chat. Our team conducted a survey in the spring. If a quick visit indicates that the conditions haven't changed, do you advise repeating the process? I would say that the answer is yes, because we want to make sure that we're like documenting any issues that still have not changed over time. And also feel free to contact me about that these specific locations. You can also when you fill out the accessibility surveys, I will receive those surveys. So I should know about them right away, but you can always feel free to also just follow up with me individually if that's easier for you as well. I'm not sure if Tatum or Tom or anyone else has input.
Sure, I'd be happy to add agreement with Brianna. Yes, it is great to do those again if the problem isn't being resolved by the local election officials or by the Secretary of the Commonwealth, thing that we need to follow up on. Unfortunately, we have heard statements coming out of the Secretary's office that there simply are not the kinds of issues that we and the people doing these surveys have observed. So as often as we can elevate these concerns and also point to issues with follow through and fixing issues regarding accessibility, I think we want to be able to do that.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you, Tatum. There's another question in the chat asking, is the emergency absentee ballot new this year in Mass, or has it previously been available? I believe it's been available for a while. I don't know if Tatum, if you have any.
Yes, it's not new. It's been around for as long as I've been working on anything voting related. I think it is underutilized. We have had issues with even the hospitals understanding their obligations and the fact that it is available for patients in their facilities. So I think it has been plagued by a lack of information by the hospitals as well as for the voters. But it isn't new.
There's another question in the chat asking from someone that is on a commission of on disability. And he says, we have one parking space that is not compliant, which is being handled. My question is about on-street spaces. I'm looking for guidance on on-street handicap parking and if we need extra parking on election day.
I think it's always a good idea to advocate for at least one space on street parking to be designated, again, even temporarily, as accessible for election day. Um, if there's parking available that is connected to the building where the polling place is, then again, as we talked about, there should be at least one accessible space. I think you said that there may be one that is being dealt with to bring it into compliance, so that's helpful. But otherwise, yeah, that there should be at least one designated on-street space as well for, and again, that can be temporary, just for election day.
Um, Someone, I think this is a really good question that I think Tom can help answer, and I think Rick pretty much already answered in the chat. How do you measure approximate slope without the level tool?
Good question. Yeah. So the standard for if you're asking about the slope of a ramp, the standard is that the slope not exceed 8.3%, which translates to one inch of rise for every 12 inches of run. So if you do have a tape measure, you would want to measure the amount of rise that would need to be covered by that ramp. So if from the ground to the level that the individual would need to get to is 5 inches, then 1 in 12 would translate to at least 5 feet of run. Run is the length. So the ramp itself would need to be at least 5 feet long in order to be equal or less than 8.3% in slope. Was that clear?
Yeah, I think so. Sometimes I know I have trouble with math, and geometry was not my specialty, so I appreciate you taking that question on. Let's see. Someone asked, I think, a really good question about early voting sites and whether we're interested in information about those sites. And I just want to reiterate Tatum's response, which was, yes, we are definitely interested in hearing about the accessibility of early voting sites as well. So if you'd like to complete polling place accessibility surveys, or if you have experience with early voting and you noticed an issue at your own polling place, at your own early voting location, we definitely want to hear about it. Let's see, is there any other questions that I've missed, or any hands raised that I don't see?
We do have a last question about whether DLC has collated the information that we are collecting, and is a report of some kind going to be available?
That's a great question. I think that so I think we do definitely collect and organize this information. Any kinds of polling place accessibility surveys that people submit on our website, we compile all of it into spreadsheets. I think a report would be a really good idea. Maybe that's something that we can think about post this election, because I think that might help a lot with our advocacy.
If I may, we have in the past compiled information to submit it to the Secretary of the Commonwealth's office. We haven't provided it in a sort of public facing report, which I totally agree with Brianna, and I think Kay, who brought up this question, it would be really helpful for us to do that. I think the bonus of what's happening in recent years is also this polling place audit tool, which allows us to gather a lot more site information. And, you know, the bigger our sample size, I think the much more meaningful a report like that will be. So we're excited to see what all of our wonderful volunteers and partners bring in this year to sort of round out the information that we're able to gather as an office.
Great, thank you. And I know we need to wrap up, but one last thought from our wonderful BCIL advocacy team. Someone said that uh, the iPhone or the phone can be measured now, like smartphones. I know the iPhone has it. I'm not sure how it works on Androids, but you can use an app to actually take measurements. So that's very cool. And they said it's the Measure app on your iPhone. So check that out if you don't have a measuring tape available. Great. I think we need to wrap up, but you have my contact information and all of DLC's information. Please feel free to reach out and to get involved in polling place accessibility surveys. And remember to register to vote and vote in this election. Thank you so much.